June 7, 1944. The morning after D-Day. Smoke drifted across the fields of Normandy, carrying the bitter scent of cordite and burning fuel. Rain fell in sheets, mixing with the blood-soaked mud that clung to soldiers' boots. In the distance, engines growled, a deep, metallic chorus that echoed through the hedgerows. The Germans heard it first, mistaking it for transport trucks. Then they saw the shapes emerge from the mist, rounded turrets, stubby guns, and star-painted hulls. The Americans were advancing. But to the men of the Wehrmacht, the sight drew laughter. Sherman's, one officer muttered, "The Americans send us toys." By mid-1944, the M4 Sherman was a tank the Germans no longer feared. Its 75mm gun could not pierce the thick hide of a panther or tiger from the front. Its armor, barely 2 inches thick in places, could be shredded by an 88mm shell before it even saw its enemy. German reports mocked it as a Ronson, like the cigarette lighter, because it lights up the first time. According to field records of the Panzer-Lehr Division, tank crews considered Sherman encounters target practice. Yet what they did not understand was that the Sherman's true weapon was never its gun. It was the system that built it, supplied it, and sent it rolling off ships faster than the Germans could destroy it. That morning, near the village of St. Lo, Sergeant Walter Freeman of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division crouched behind a hedgerow, rain dripping from his helmet. Over the crackle of the radio came the order, "Move up, now." His platoon of 5 Shermans roared to life, engines coughing smoke into the cold air. Freeman's tank lurched forward, treads crushing the wet earth. Through his periscope, he caught glimpses of orchards, stone walls, and flashes of enemy fire. The Germans were dug in with 88mm guns, waiting. "Keep it moving," Freeman shouted into his intercom. The tanks advanced, shells exploding around them, mud flying against their hulls. 2 Shermans burst into flames, their crews scrambling out. But the others kept going. Behind them, more tanks appeared, dozens, then hundreds. A line of steel stretching beyond the fog. From a ridge overlooking the battlefield, Oberleutnant Karl Wehrmann of the 12th SS Panzer Division watched in disbelief. Through his binoculars, he counted the silhouettes, endless columns of green machines crawling over the fields. "They keep coming," he said quietly. His gunner replied, "How many do they have?" There was no answer. For months, German intelligence had underestimated American production. They knew the Americans could build planes and ships, but not this. This flood of armor, each tank replaced before the last one burned. In truth, the M4 Sherman was a machine of compromise. It wasn't the strongest, nor the most heavily armed, but it was the one that worked everywhere. Its 9-cylinder radial engine, built originally for aircraft by Continental and later by Ford, gave it a speed of nearly 25 miles per hour on open ground. Its suspension could survive the rocky hills of Italy, the sands of North Africa, and now the thick hedgerows of Normandy. At 33 tons, it was light enough to cross hastily built bridges, yet heavy enough to mount a 75mm gun that fired high-explosive rounds capable of shredding bunkers and infantry positions. The Americans hadn't designed it to duel Tigers. They had designed it to win wars. In the days after D-Day, over 15,000 Shermans were already in Europe, and more poured in every week. Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant, run by Chrysler, had become a city of steel, its furnaces glowing day and night. At its peak, a new Sherman rolled off the line every 25 minutes. Rail lines carried them to ports, ships carried them across the Atlantic, and cranes lifted them straight into the fight. German intelligence reports intercepted later revealed disbelief at such numbers. "They replace their tanks faster than we destroy them," one Wehrmacht signal read. That was the essence of America's new warfare. Logistics as a weapon. On the ground, the soldiers learned Sherman's virtues the hard way. Its turret traverse was electric, quicker than most German tanks, allowing it to fire faster in close fights. Its radio system, standardized across every model, let platoons coordinate fire with infantry and aircraft in real time. The Germans, still relying on unreliable field radios and hand signals, found themselves outmaneuvered by a force that seemed to communicate as one mind. It was like fighting a machine that could think, recalled a captured Panzer officer years later in a post-war interview. What the Germans mocked as inferior design was, in truth, superior coordination. The hedgerows of Normandy turned into killing grounds for both sides. The thick earth walls trapped tanks in narrow lanes where ambushes waited. But American crews adapted. Engineers welded steel bars and logs onto the fronts of their Shermans, creating improvised hedgerow cutters that burst through the walls like battering rams. By July, entire units of modified tanks were plowing through terrain the Germans had thought impassable. Field notes from the 2nd Armored Division record that German ambushes began to fail simply because the Americans refused to stay where we expected them. Adaptation became its own weapon. Still, the cost was immense. Every village fought over was littered with burning tanks. Crews nicknamed their vehicles death traps with grim humor, knowing that a single hit could ignite the ammunition stored in the hull. Yet they climbed back in every morning. Replacement tanks arrived as fast as replacements for men. This relentless rhythm, the cycle of loss and renewal, wore the Germans down. They destroyed hundreds, then thousands, but the flow never stopped. By August, as the Allies broke through at St. Lo, the German 7th Army was in retreat. Panthers and Tigers were abandoned for lack of fuel, their crews fleeing on foot. Behind them, American columns stretched as far as the eye could see, Sherman's leading convoys of trucks, half-tracks, and artillery, a moving wall of industry in one village outside Falaise. A German infantryman watched the horizon burn. Through the haze, he saw more of the toys rolling forward, their engines steady, their hulls gleaming in the morning light. "There is no end to them," he whispered. His officer said nothing. They had fought the Soviet T-34 in the east, but this was different. The Americans were not merely fighting, they were replacing. The battlefield itself seemed to regenerate overnight as the German line collapsed. Allied commanders realized the scale of what their industry had achieved. In just over 2 years, the United States had built more than 49,000 Shermans, each one a part of a vast mechanical organism fed by shipyards, railroads, and assembly lines. Every nut and bolt represented a worker back home. Rosy riveting plates in Detroit, engineers testing engines in Cleveland, and laborers in Pittsburgh pouring steel through the night. The tank may have been mocked by its enemies, but it carried with it the strength of a nation that refused to stop. When German officers surrendered weeks later, many spoke bitterly about the Shermans. "They were not good tanks," one said, "but there were always more." In that simple line lay the truth that had crushed them. Power was no longer defined by caliber or armor thickness. It was measured in endurance, in the will to produce, and the capacity to replace. The Panther might win the duel, but the Sherman would win the war. As dusk settled over Normandy, the fields glowed with the fires of wreckage, German tanks smoldering beside American ones. Among the survivors, a grim realization took root. The balance of the war had shifted forever. From that point on, Germany would retreat, not just from the front lines, but from an industrial war it could no longer sustain. And in the gathering darkness, the engines of the Shermans kept rumbling, one after another, like a heartbeat the enemy could not silence. In the summer of 1944, deep within the hedgerows and shattered villages of Normandy, the myth of German invincibility began to die, not with a single explosion, but with the grinding roar of thousands of Sherman engines. What had started as mockery was turning into panic. The same German officers who had once laughed at America's Ronson-lighters now cursed them as unstoppable. Behind every burned-out Panther lay the realization that the enemy was no longer playing by the same rules. The secret was not the Sherman's gun, nor its armor. It was the network that fed it, the engineers, factories, and supply lines that turned the United States into the greatest manufacturing machine in history. At the height of production, more than 2,000 American companies contributed parts to the M4 Sherman. From locomotive builders in Pennsylvania to aircraft plants in California, the tank became the symbol of industrial unity. The Ford Motor Company built engines by the tens of thousands, while the Chrysler-run Detroit Arsenal tank plant assembled them at a pace unheard of in Europe. One government report proudly stated, "The factory is now a front line." The Germans never grasped that scale. Their tanks were masterpieces, crafted with precision, but slow to build and hard to repair. A single Tiger required over 300,000 man-hours to complete. The Sherman, by contrast, took less than 10,000. Its parts were standardized so perfectly that a damaged tank could be stripped and rebuilt in hours. "We fix them faster than they break," one American mechanic wrote home. At field depots, captured enemy mechanics were stunned to see racks of spare parts lined up like ammunition. The Sherman was not just a machine. It was a system designed to survive through replacement. The most feared German tanks, the Panther and the Tiger, boasted guns that could pierce the Sherman at over a mile. Their crews knew it. But what they also learned, painfully, was that the Sherman could reach them first. Its speed, nearly 25 miles per hour over rough terrain, allowed it to outflank and surround heavier tanks before they could turn their turrets. And its turret rotation, electrically powered, 360 degrees in 15 seconds, was twice as fast as most German designs. Many duels came down to reaction time, not firepower. "We hit them first because we could aim faster," recalled a U.S. gunner from the 4th Armored Division, WWII August. A new model appeared on the battlefield, the M4A3 Sherman, equipped with the 76mm high-velocity gun, developed under the supervision of engineer William Knudsen and the Ordnance Department. It could penetrate up to 100 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, finally giving the Americans a fighting chance against the Panther's sloped plates. A report from Aberdeen Proving Ground recorded that the improved gun gave confidence back to the crews. The tank's heart, a 500-horsepower Ford GAA engine, was a marvel of wartime adaptation, derived from aircraft V-12 designs but simplified for ground use. It burned less fuel, ran quieter, and could be repaired with basic tools. Still, technology alone could not explain the scale of what unfolded next, the breakout from Normandy known as Operation Cobra. On July 25, 1944, after weeks of brutal stalemate in the hedgerows, Allied forces unleashed over 1,500 bombers in a concentrated assault near St. Lo. When the dust cleared, German defenses lay shattered. Into that breach poured the Shermans, hundreds of them, advancing in waves across open ground. In their path stood remnants of the Panzer-Lehr Division and elements of the 2nd SS Panzer. The Germans fought with courage but not coherence. For every tank they destroyed, 5 more appeared. Sergeant Walter Freeman, whose platoon had survived D-Day, led his crew through the rolling fields near Coutances. "Keep your interval," he shouted over the roar of the engine. Ahead, the ground trembled under artillery fire. The smell of gasoline and smoke clung to the air. They crested a hill, and there, in the distance, stood a Panther, its gun turning toward them. Freeman's gunner fired first. The shell ricocheted off the Germans' sloped armor. The Panther's reply was instant. A flash, a boom, and the earth shook. Freeman's tank lurched, tracks half torn off. "Bail," his loader yelled. Freeman looked at the horizon. Dozens more Shermans were coming up the road behind them. "No," he said. "We hold." Moments later, another Sherman swung left, fired, and the Panther burst into flames. The line advanced. German war diaries from that day speak of disbelief. "The enemy attacks in endless depth," wrote one officer from Panzer-Lehr. "Destroy one, and 3 more come." Supply trucks carrying shells and fuel were lost to air attacks. Panthers ran dry before they reached the front. Mechanics cannibalized wrecks to keep others running. In contrast, American convoys rolled in constantly, fresh tanks, spare engines, and fuel drums stacked in every jeep. The sheer rhythm of replacement became a weapon. The front was no longer moved by tactics, but by momentum. In this chaos, an unlikely hero emerged, the Sherman Firefly. Designed in Britain and armed with the fearsome 17-pounder gun, it could finally kill a Tiger at long range. The British converted over 2,000 Shermans into Fireflies, their slender barrels sticking out like lances among the standard 75mm guns. In combined formations, U.S. and British crews coordinated strikes. Standard Shermans drew enemy fire, while Fireflies delivered killing blows from cover. German crews began calling them Panzer Assassins. One veteran recalled, "Dramatized composite, the first shot from that long gun cut our Tiger in half." The Battle of St. Lo marked a turning point. What had been a bloody crawl became a sprint. The American armored divisions fanned out, surrounding German units that could not retreat fast enough. The M4's reliability, its ability to run day after day with minimal maintenance, made it the perfect pursuit weapon. In August, at the Falaise Pocket, over 50,000 German troops were trapped as Shermans rolled in from all sides. The roads became graveyards of burned vehicles and shattered equipment. Pilots circling above reported lines of tanks stretching beyond the horizon. "It was not a battle," said one Allied officer. "It was an avalanche." Behind that avalanche was an army of invisible hands. Engineers at Ford, General Motors, and Westinghouse worked around the clock refining transmissions, improving armor castings, and upgrading optics. The process was iterative and relentless. Each battlefield report went straight to design boards back home. When troops complained of ammunition fires, new wet storage systems were introduced within weeks, dramatically reducing crew casualties. It was industrial warfare at its purest, feedback loops between the front line and the factory, turning field lessons into mechanical evolution. The Germans, fighting on dwindling resources, could not keep pace. Their tanks grew heavier, slower, and fewer. The Tiger II, introduced that summer, was a behemoth, 70 tons, nearly invincible on paper. But it guzzled fuel and broke down constantly. Fewer than 500 were ever built. The Americans built that many Shermans every week. As one German prisoner told his interrogators, "We fought machines, but they had more machines than we had bullets." By September, the Sherman columns were crossing the Seine, driving toward Paris. What had begun as a risky invasion was now a tidal wave of armor, grinding eastward. German commanders who had once mocked American steel now watched their maps fill with blue arrows. The Sherman was everywhere, on every road, in every field, and in every retreating German's nightmares. The joke was over. What the Germans had dismissed as a toy had become the face of industrial annihilation. As the tanks rolled across France, the old order of war, duels of elite machines, was replaced by something colder, larger, and more terrifying: the realization that mass, not mastery, decides the outcome. The Tiger might win a battle. The Sherman would win a continent. By the autumn of 1944, the fields of France had become graveyards of armor. Panthers and Tigers lay smoldering beside Shermans, their hulks twisted into blackened silhouettes against the pale sky. Yet only one side could afford those losses. For every Sherman burning on a Normandy road, two more were already unloading at Cherbourg or marching east from supply depots. The Germans watched in disbelief as American columns seemed to regenerate overnight, steel reborn from the ashes of its own destruction. What they faced now was not just an army. It was an industrial phenomenon. In September, as Allied forces pushed toward the German border, the full effect of that phenomenon became impossible to ignore. The Wehrmacht had fewer than 1,500 operational tanks left on the Western Front. The Allies fielded more than 10 times that number. Even the vaunted panzer divisions, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, were running on fumes, short of fuel, spare parts, and trained crews. The American advance was not measured in miles, but in gallons. As long as the pipelines flowed and factories back home kept humming, the Shermans would never stop. Behind this relentless advance was a network of logistics unlike anything the world had ever seen. Every tank that crossed France carried the invisible weight of 1,000 workers. Dock laborers in New York, mechanics in Bristol, and assembly line welders in Detroit all had a hand in each machine's survival. The U.S. Army's Red Ball Express, a convoy system of over 6,000 trucks driven mostly by African-American soldiers, hauled fuel and ammunition day and night. They called it feeding the beast. And the beast, those endless Sherman battalions, was always hungry. The German army had no answer for a machine that could rebuild itself while still fighting. Psychologically, the effect was devastating. German soldiers who had once mocked the American tank now feared the sound of its engine more than artillery. Veterans of the Eastern Front admitted in captured diaries that the Americans fight like machines. They do not stop. Panzer officers reported exhaustion and despair as their units disintegrated. The superiority of the Tiger's gun no longer mattered. The battlefield had become a math problem, and the numbers were merciless. For every Panther that scored a kill, it was surrounded, flanked, and destroyed. They came from every side, recalled one German tanker years later. Dramatized composite, we could not even aim fast enough. It was like drowning in iron. Meanwhile, the Allies had turned the Sherman into more than a tank. It was an entire family of machines. Variants rolled off the lines with new purposes. The M4A3E8, Easy 8, with improved suspension and high-velocity gun. The M32 recovery tank fitted with cranes to haul the wounded. The M4 Crocodile flamethrower. And the Calliope, with racks of 60 rockets screaming from its turret. Engineers in Britain and America experimented with dozer blades, mine flails, and bridge-laying attachments, transforming one chassis into 100 tools of war. The Sherman became the Swiss Army knife of the battlefield. Every need was met by adaptation. Every problem answered with innovation. By the time the Allies reached the Siegfried Line, the contrast was absolute. Germany's armored divisions had become museum pieces, rare, irreplaceable, and fragile. Each Tiger required a convoy of support vehicles just to move a few miles. The Sherman, by contrast, could be repaired in the field with a wrench and a welding torch. A broken track, a cracked transmission, or even a burned-out engine could be replaced in hours. Crews took pride in keeping their tanks alive. Maintenance was their ritual, their religion. "We kept her running," one veteran later said, "because if she stopped, so did the war." The strategic consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. The Sherman's mass production allowed the Allies to equip entire armies, not just American, but British, Canadian, Free French, and Polish forces. In total, more than 49,000 rolled off American assembly lines, with another 7,000 built under license abroad. The sight of those tanks flying different flags, yet sharing the same design, became a symbol of unity through machinery. It was proof that democracy could outproduce dictatorship. Where Germany relied on craftsmanship, America relied on capacity. The result was overwhelming, but the human cost was enormous. Thousands of American tankers died in those machines, burned, buried, or simply erased in explosions that left no trace. For every column that rolled forward, men knew they might not see another sunrise. Letters found in wrecked Shermans spoke of exhaustion, fear, and quiet pride. "We know they're better," one gunner wrote of the German tanks, "but we have more." That fatalistic acceptance became the mindset of the Armored Corps. Each crew was part of something larger than survival, an industrial tide that would not stop until Berlin fell, when the winter came. Bringing the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, the Shermans faced their greatest trial. In the frozen forests of Belgium, German Panthers and King Tigers struck with brutal precision, tearing through Allied lines. For a moment, it seemed history might repeat itself. But as the snow settled, new Sherman units arrived, hundreds of them, with improved 76mm guns and thicker armor. They counterattacked through blizzards, surrounding and destroying the last armored spearheads of the Reich. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. The Americans, bruised but unbroken, had once again proven that persistence could outlast perfection. In the months that followed, the Allies crossed the Rhine. The roads into Germany were lined with the wreckage of what had once been the most feared tanks on Earth. Many had been abandoned without a fight, their fuel tanks empty. In towns like Remagen and Cologne, Sherman crews rolled past civilians who stared in silence at the endless convoys. The thunder of their engines had become the soundtrack of inevitability. The Reich was dying under the weight of American steel. When victory finally came in May 1945, it was not the mightiest tank that symbolized the end, but the most common. The Sherman had done what it was built to do: move, fight, survive, repeat. It had carried the war from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany, across rivers, hedgerows, and city ruins. It had been mocked, burned, rebuilt, and mocked again, but it never stopped. Historians later called it the tank that won the war. The truth is simpler. It was the tank that never quit. In the years that followed, its legacy spread across the world. Sherman tanks served in dozens of armies, from Korea to the Middle East. They became symbols of resilience, proof that practicality could outlive perfection. Museums displayed them not as relics of might, but as reminders of endurance. Engineers studied their design to understand the power of simplicity. Soldiers remembered the sound of their engines, the feel of steel under their hands, and the way they never failed to start when needed. And somewhere, in the quiet fields of Normandy, a few still stand, rusted, scarred. Their stars faded, but not forgotten. They marked the path of an army that turned mockery into momentum and weakness into victory. In the end, the Germans had been right about one thing. The Sherman was no masterpiece of design. It was something far greater, a machine built by a nation that refused to stop building. In modern war, as one U.S. ordnance officer wrote in 1946, the strongest weapon is not the biggest gun, it's the factory behind it. And in 1944, on the fields of France, those factories rolled forward on treads of steel, crushing everything in their path.